Everybody, if I didn't say already, and thank you very much for joining the webinar. And today it's the second installment, and this installment is about the annexation plans. But before I start with that, it's a very, very, very short, lightening kind of introduction. So I said last time that the two things, Trump's plan and the annexation, they come together. It's a kind of package deal, and I explained why. I won't do it again. Then we talked about the two kinds of conflicts, right with right and right with wrong, and how that drives how we see the resolution of the conflict and how we see proposed solutions from third parties. And we talked about the fact that there is no two-state deal that satisfies a majority on both sides of the divide. And finally, we try to draw some conclusions, and it's only one conclusion that I'm going to remind people about. So Trump's plan includes some new details, but not a lot. The principles are the same. What is new in this plan is this, and it's not a plan actually. You won't find it, you won't read it in the plan. But it's policy. It's a willingness to start implementing certain aspects of the plan unilaterally if the Palestinians refuse to negotiate. Okay, this is entirely new. Before that, every proposal that was there, the moment the Palestinian leadership said no, then everybody went home and probably vented their frustration on spouses and children. Trump doesn't want to do that. Some might say that Mrs. Melania Trump is a lucky lady because of that. Well, some might say, but most probably won't. Anyway, the topic today is the annexation. And why are we talking about this? Because there's a paragraph in Israel's latest coalition agreement which says that the Prime Minister Netanyahu can bring the agreement about the application of sovereignty to a debate in the cabinet, to approval of the cabinet, to approval of the government and or of the Knesset. It doesn't say application over what, okay? It leaves that very vague. And the coalition agreement is a long document. I'm a sad person, and so I read it. It contains many things. It talks about peace agreements, strive towards future peace agreements, and so on. But nobody was very interested in that. It's just the annexation bit that attracted the attention of everybody. Now, I keep saying annexation, and I'm conscious that some of you will be screaming into the screens, no, don't use that term, you can't say annexation, and so on. But what can we do? Some people call it annexation. And, annexation is not necessarily a negative term, although I see that in Cambridge it is, but in other places probably not. Others call it various other things. I will call it something else. I will call it incorporation. Not just because I want to be original, not just because, I want to be a little bit objective and neutral here, but I have other reasons as well. So there is actually a legal term, at least in American law, and I think in legislation elsewhere as well, there is a legal term of incorporated territory. Okay, in case you didn't know, it's not just Israel that has territories. USA also has territories. And what's a territory? It's an area that is controlled, ruled, governed by USA, but it's not a state, and it's not part of a state either. And there are two kinds of territories. incorporated territory is a territory where the US Constitution applies in full. And there's unincorporated territory where the US Constitution doesn't apply. Only basic freedoms, only fundamental freedoms or fundamental human rights apply there. Okay? And if you want examples, Arizona, Oklahoma, and New Mexico were all incorporated territories before they were accepted as states in the Union. Okay? But there are also unincorporated territories, and the best known unincorporated territory, I think, is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is governed by USA, belongs to USA, is ruled by USA for more than a century already, but the US Constitution does not apply there. And that's why Puerto Ricans don't have a right to vote for US presidential elections. They won't be voting in November. They're not represented in the US Congress. They have, I think, an observer in the House of Representatives, but without right of vote. I think that's right. Don't catch me on that, but I think they send an observer to the House of Representatives, but they don't have any right of vote there. And this is called an incorporated territory, not an apartheid, folks. Okay, that's an unincorporated territory. So, with that in mind, what is incorporation? In this case, it's application of the US Constitution over a certain territory, but in general speaking, it's application of a country's laws over a territory that that country already controls, okay, already rules. And that's exactly what we are talking about. That's why I decided to call this incorporation, because that's what we are talking about. When we say annexation, however we call it, we are talking about the application of Israeli civilian law over parts of Area C of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, however you want to call it, okay? That's what we're talking about. So in other words, incorporation of those territories. Now, Area C, just to remind everybody, according to the Oslo Accords, has been placed under Israeli control. It's 60% of the West Bank, and it's inhabited by Palestinians and by Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. And the Israeli Jews, you know, many countries will call them settlers or illegal settlers, but, you know, both these populations live there. Now, we're talking about applying Israeli civilian law. So what is the current situation there? What is the law that governs that piece of territory? And the short answer is it depends, okay? It depends. For Israeli citizens, it's simple. The law is the Israeli civilian law, like for any Israeli, okay? For non-citizens, residents of those territories that are not Israeli citizens, and just to be clear here, because I spoke previously about Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, the definition is not about Jews and Arabs. It's about Israeli citizens, Jews, Arabs, whatever they might be, on one hand, and on the other hand, non-citizens, okay? For non-citizens, it depends again, okay? For security offenses, that is, if somebody plans a terrorist attack or throws stones on the soldiers, the law is the Israeli military decrees or military provisions or military orders that are published in that territory, okay? For criminal offenses, if somebody steals some money, then it's the law of the land. What is the law of the land? Well, in principle, it's the law that prevailed in that territory before Israel took it over. That is before 1967. And that's in principle, again, not the Jordanian law, but not the current Jordanian law, the Jordanian law before 1967. Now, I don't know how good the Jordanian law is now, but before 1967, I don't think it was that good. It has a lot of areas it doesn't cover, and that it has areas where it does cover, but in a way that's not acceptable in modern society, okay? And so in those cases, we go back to British mandate legislation. And where neither Jordanian law nor British mandate legislation gives us a solution, especially that's true of land ownership issues, then we go back to Ottoman laws that were enacted more than 100 years ago, okay? So it's a mishmash of these things. Now, you see already the problem, and the problem is not just the mishmash. The problem is that you have two systems of laws for two categories of people, okay? Very unusual, and I would say unpleasant. It's true that, you know, there are appeals, and these systems converge when you appeal. You can appeal up to and including the Israeli Supreme Court, and so the systems converge, but still you have these two different systems, and that annoys a lot of people. For instance, this young Jewish guy who was brought on a tour of the West Bank and brought to see the proceedings of a military court in the West Bank, and he was very displeased. He wasn't impressed. He says Palestinians are forced into military courts with military judges under military law, and on the other hand, Israelis are judged under, he says, civil courts. I think he means civilian courts, and so on. And obviously, you know, the conclusion is segregation, discrimination, apartheid, and so on and so forth. And you're thinking, why is Israel doing this? Why have two systems of laws? Why have two categories of people? I mean, obviously, you can't judge Israeli citizens by military law, because that would be completely illegal unless they commit an offense while serving in the military. Otherwise, you can't. But why not bring the Palestinians that committed offenses and judge them under normal Israeli law? It turns out that this would be illegal. This would be illegal. Why? Because the Geneva Convention prohibits an occupying power from changing the laws of an occupied territory, okay? You can't change the law. You're obliged to keep the laws as they are, with one exception. You can repeal or suspend certain provisions of the laws only in cases where they threaten the security of the occupying power or the soldiers and so on. And you're only allowed to enact legal provisions, military legal provisions, military orders, only where essential to ensure the security of the occupying power and the members of the occupying power and so on. That's all. And in those cases, you can bring the occupying power can bring the accused to its properly constituted non-political military courts, but only if those courts sit in the occupied country. If you ask yourself why the Israeli military courts for Palestinians sit in the West Bank rather than in Israel, where there are anyway military courts, this is why, okay? This is the, now why did they make these provisions at the Geneva Convention? The intention was very good. The intention was to protect the civilian population. So the occupying power can't enact laws that, you know, puts them at a disadvantage. The intention was very good, but sometimes with these things, the result is not so good. But the main point is the occupying power can't change the law of the land. If it applies its own law, that means that it annexes the territory. And indeed, once Israel incorporates that territory, it applies its law, and then the law is equal for everybody. Once it's the Israeli law, it's the Israeli law for everybody who lives in that territory. Okay? But we're talking about incorporation. What's going to be incorporated? We don't know. Okay? We don't know. It could be a lot of things. It could be nothing. In the end, it could be all talk and no action. It could be settlements. It could be some settlements, all settlements, the Jordan Valley settlements, all areas that the Trump plan gave to Israel, or even some sort of progressive, staged, gradual annexation and so on. We don't know. And because we don't know, I'm going to assume that it's paragraph 5 here, because it's the most extensive one. And I'm not telling you any secret. There are plenty of objections to incorporation or annexation, however you want to call it. And I think I can distinguish 3 different strains of this objection. First of all, moral objections. If you do this, it's the wrong thing to do. It's your oppressors, colonialists, apartheid, and so on. There are legal or legalistic objections. It's contrary to international law. And there are what I would call practical objections, which is, it might not be immoral, it might not be illegal, but it's counterproductive. Okay? It won't do any good. Now, I'm trying to be objective and a bit neutral here, but I've got to admit that I have very little time for the moral objectors, okay? Because I think if you think that Jews are colonialists in Judea, then, you take this right versus wrong view of the conflict, and that makes you part of the problem, not part of the solution. However, let's address some of the claims at least. So there is this claim that if Israel annexes part of the West Bank, it will become an apartheid state. Why? Because the territory left for Palestinians would constitute Bantustans, like in South Africa. And I think we've all seen these infographics. They show the Palestinian territory, they show the Bantustans in former apartheid South Africa, and they kind of look the same. They use the same colors, so they look the same. And if they look the same, they're probably the same. But those who are in favor of incorporation will say something else. They'll say, look, these claims of apartheid state and so on, they've been around for many years already. Nothing to do with annexation. It's just this kind of people who want to declare Israel an apartheid state. And these infographics have been around. You can see this is from 2018, and it's kind of the same, but they've been there before. So it's not about it. Still, I'm kind of a systematic kind of guy. I always want to check things. So I like to go to the definitions. So what's a Bantustan? Because some of us might know, might have experienced things, but some of us might not. So officially they were called homelands, okay? What were they? They were pieces of territory in a way similar to the reservations for Indians in North America, okay? Pieces of territory where the blacks in South Africa were moved to. Citizens of South Africa, they were stripped of citizenship and moved to these areas and made to live in this area. Why? Because the apartheid regime was based on a racialist view of the world, okay, with superior races and inferior races, and they couldn't get mixed and they couldn't live together. But that's not what we are talking about here. I mean, the Palestinian Arabs are not being moved anywhere. They will continue to live where they live today. There's no, and certainly, Israel has no intention of stripping its Arab citizens of citizenship and moving them to the West Bank. Not to mention that Jews in Judea are not like white people in Africa. You know, white people in Africa are a colonial implant with no historical roots in the land. And also the Bantustan system, as I said, was based on a racialist view of the world, while what we're talking about here, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, is just an attempt to solve the conflict. It's not that we can't make any comparisons with South Africa. There are things that we can learn from South Africa. For instance, look at these yellow bits here, okay? These folks are not Bantustans. They are independent countries. They are enclaves within the territory of South Africa, but they are independent countries, members of the United Nations. One is called Lesotho, one is called the Kingdom of Eswatini, or some people call it Swaziland. Why aren't they Bantustans? Why are they recognized as members of the United Nations? Because people were not moved there. People lived there normally and wanted to be independent. And whether the state looks like an enclave or not is not the main thing. Then there is another claim that if Israel annexes territories and does not offer Israeli citizenship to the Palestinians who live there, then it would cease to be a democratic state. And the only problem with that is nobody says that's going to be the situation. Actually, Israel's ambassador has said several times that that's not going to be the situation. And it hasn't been the situation in the past. I mean, in 1949, Israel has annexed some territories and offered citizenship to the Arabs that lived there. In East Jerusalem, Israel offered citizenship when it annexed it. And the Golan Heights, the same. But still, there are these claims, and they, you know, I hear these claims for a long time already, but more recently, they come based on a certain interview that Netanyahu gave. And in that interview, he said, look, we're not going to annex all Palestinian areas. Some areas, for instance, Jericho, we will not annex. And those areas that we will not annex, we don't have any reason to give the Palestinians living there Israeli citizenship. They're not annexed. They will remain Palestinian subjects, meaning subjects of the Palestinian Authority, citizens of a Palestinian state, if there is a Palestinian state. But some organizations continue to say that Israel will not offer citizenship to the Palestinians on areas that it intends to annex. That's the exact opposite of what Netanyahu said. He said the areas we're not annexing. So this is a lie, quite frankly. Now, legal objections. You know, I'm going to make this short because we could talk for hours about legal objections, and some people think we got a legal title on the land from the Bible, from the Torah, and other people say the San Remo conference, the British mandate, and so on. I don't think we need to go so far back, because this is actually to do with borders, okay? And I think the relevant legal document is the Armistice Agreement between Israel and Jordan from 1949, which says quite clearly that this is not peace, okay? This is just a military ceasefire. That's what it is. And because it's not peace, the armistice demarcation lines are not political borders. They are just military cease lines. That's ceasefire lines. That's all that they are. And that those provisions in the agreement were introduced at the request of Jordan, not of Israel. Israel would have liked to make peace, but Jordan didn't want to recognize those lines as borders. So if they're not borders, if they're not political borders, if they're just ceasefire lines, you can't apply the legislation that pertains to borders and say, you know, it's against international law. That's a sleight of hand. Okay, they're not borders; they're armistice lines. Now, before I go any further, I wonder, Judy, I wonder if there are some questions. I'd like to take a short break, maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, so I don't quite know if they work with what you've covered so far, but Melvin Lipich asked, do you think the Supreme Court's decision to overturn legislation law will affect the proposed application of Israeli law, civilian law, to parts of Judea and Samaria?
Okay, so for those that so that is a very recent decision of the Israeli Supreme Court that said that a certain piece of legislation that the previous government passed, which is called the regulation law, it repealed it. Okay, it said it's unconstitutional and took it off the statutes, as it were. But that law pertains to private property, and there's a clear distinction in law between private property over land and sovereignty. They're two completely different things. So I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm allowed to buy land in the UK, but the fact that I, an Israeli citizen, own a piece of land in the UK doesn't make it part of Israel, doesn't make it part of Israeli sovereignty. It remains under UK sovereignty. It's just in my private property. And so the answer is no. That decision by the Supreme Court has nothing to do with the question of sovereignty. It has to do with the question of private property. Whether you can expropriate private property. So nothing to do with that.
Okay, so Ray Wixman is asking that there are a raft of factors that could influence the annexation policy, including Likud right-wing allies who are deeply bitter that not all settlements will be included, to potential inflaming and hostile Arab opinion with Israel's green lines. Are these issues that you're going to cover?
I'm going to cover some of them, and mainly I'm going to cover external issues and not issues that are internal, that pertain to Israel domestic policy. And the first thing that, sorry, Julian, wasn't it? Was it?
No, that was Ray.
Ray, sorry, Ray. So the first part of the question was about there are people kind of on the hard right among the settler movement and so on that really don't like all this because mainly because it kind of leaves them out of the territory that will be annexed. But the problem these people have is that they are in a minority currently. And not just they are in a minority in the parliament, but they are in a minority where they can't even cooperate with the main part of the opposition because they hold completely different political positions. And so whether They like it or not, I'm afraid, you know, it's a democracy, and if the majority decides, they'll have to swallow the pill, I think. The other part of the question, which pertains to external issues of foreign policy, that I'll cover in a moment, actually.
Okay, so there's another question from Alistair Rossenstein, who says that given that the Palestinian leadership has announced they will unilaterally declare independence over the 1967 lines if Israel annexes part of the West Bank, how will this impact on Netanyahu's behaviour?
Very little, very little it will impact, if anything. These Palestinian declarations, in my opinion, are issued for internal domestic purposes. So the government, which is the Palestinian Authority, is seen to be doing something. But what is the practical purpose there? The Palestinians have issued a declaration of independence in 1988, okay? According to them, Palestine is an independent country since 1988. And since then, they've done it a couple more times, and they've been seen as a country, as an independent state, by the General Assembly of the UN, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing particularly new there. I'm sure Netanyahu will, you know, will make a scene over that and will say, you know, they're breaking the agreements by declaring unilaterally and so on and so forth. But beyond that, I don't see any practical importance to that kind of declaration. It's for internal consumption, as we say. Shall I go on?
Okay, there's a couple of comments that have just come in, but yes, do go on.
Okay, well, we'll have a much longer Q&A session at the end, I promise. Oh, I forgot to do that again. Okay, so we come now to another sort of objections, which is practical objections, as we said. And the first one I'm going to discuss is the one I read everywhere. You know, if Israel annexes part of the West Bank, that will destroy any possibility of the two-state solution. And of course, that's very unpleasant because we are being told by many people that if it's not the two-state solution, it can only be the one-state solution, right? Now, the other side of the argument, they'll say something else, right? Something like that. But what I am concerned with, what I don't understand, is why. I've read all these articles, you know, spells the end of the two-state solution and so on and so forth. But then none of these articles explain why. I don't understand why. And I'm left to guess. One guess is, okay, the Palestinian leaders will no longer want to negotiate. That's reasonable. We know they're angry, but we also know that they don't negotiate. They didn't negotiate before. And when they did negotiate in the past, we couldn't reach any agreement. So that's kind of a weak argument. It doesn't change much. But there's another argument. And this argument is, look, if you take this territory away, then you won't leave enough territory for the Palestinians to establish a contiguous and viable state. And we can argue what's enough and what's not enough, what's contiguous, what's viable, and so on. But there is this kind of argument. The problem is, I don't quite understand it. Because what does it mean taking away this territory? Where are we taking it? We're not taking it to the moon. The territory stays there. And the fact that it will be under Israeli law does it change anything actually? Because we know that Israel has already annexed East Jerusalem, and yet in previous negotiations, remember Olmert, remember the Clinton parameters and so on, Israel has envisaged ceding, relinquishing part of East Jerusalem, despite it being annexed. And the same is true about the Golan Heights. Israel annexed the Golan Heights in the 80s, I think. But after that, there were serious negotiations with the Syrians in which Israel envisaged ceding part of the Golan or all of the Golan. And in fact, also in this plan, in Trump's plan, Israel is supposed to give the Palestinian state territories that are now part of Israel under Israeli law. So just because you have some territory under Israeli law doesn't mean it's taken away and irrecoverable. I mean, if next year or in 5 years, Palestinian leadership that is credible and so on comes and says, we really want to make peace with Israel, but we need this piece of territory here. I mean, I don't know if Israel will want to give it to the Palestinian state, but it can. The fact that it's under Israeli law doesn't change the possibility to give it or to cede it. Okay, so I still don't understand, and I wish somebody explained to me why this, determination that it's the end of the two-state solution. I don't quite understand it. But there are other issues as well. There is fear of a Palestinian reaction. They'll cancel all agreements. They'll cease security cooperation with Israel. There will be a third intifada, terrorism, and so on. But many Israelis will say, look, we've seen all this before. They threatened us before with the canceling of agreements, with ceasing security cooperation. Actually, they don't comply with the agreements. They only comply with the parts that they like. And they depend on security cooperation with Israel more than Israel depends on them, because unless Israel backs them, Hamas is going to take them over. And there's also the boy who cried wolf effect, okay? You told us before, when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, you told us that there will be violent chaos and so on and so forth. There wasn't much. And we can't really, manage things according to what the Palestinians say. Every time they threaten us with violence, we're supposed to back off. It can't, a state doesn't conduct itself like that. There's, of course, concern about a more general Arab reaction. Jordan will cancel the peace agreement and so on and so forth. There will be violence in the Arab street. But again, many Israelis will say, oh, come on, that won't happen. They don't care that much about Palestinians. It's all lip service. And, in the end, nothing much will happen. And there's, again, the boy who cried wolf effect. Then there is understandable concern about the European reaction. Europe can enact sanctions against Israel in principle. For instance, it can suspend Israel's association agreement, which would mean that certain Israeli-made goods would be taxed, would be subject to custom duties in Europe. That would hurt somewhat Israeli economy, but that's very unlikely, actually. But there are other smaller agreements that the Europeans might push Israel out of it. And there's other things as well. But again, there will be those who will say that won't actually happen. They'll talk to us very sternly, but in the end, they won't do much because, we have our friends in Europe and they won't let it happen. And we have other potential things that we can do, and so on and so forth. And you know, I don't want to bore you too much, but kind of the same kind of dynamic about the reaction of the Democratic Party in the US. You know, the same kind, you know, there will be those who will say, if Sanders would be president, then we would have sanctions anyway, annexation or no annexation. And if it's Biden, then Biden has said already that there won't be sanctions, annexation or not annexation. But now we come to you guys, okay? Effect on diaspora jury. And something that I heard repeatedly here in the UK is what Israel does affects us because it can intensify anti-Semitism, okay? I had a discussion on Facebook recently with a guy who's actually Israeli. You know, he's as British as I am, let me say. He's not even born in Britain. He's Israeli, but he lives here and he got involved in politics. I think he's a member of the UK Labour Party, and he's a deputy on the board of deputies. And he thinks he represents now diaspora Jewry, although, you know, he's Israeli like I am. And he said, listen, if Israel does that, there might be anti-Semitic attacks and so on. And I have to say I wasn't impressed, because I said, look, if you say something like this, first of all, you kind of justify anti-Semitism. You say that anti-Semites are kind of justified. You understand that they will take their indignation on diaspora Jews, on British Jews, who have nothing to do with what Israeli does. You know, they don't vote in Israel. And the second thing is, what do you want Israel to do? I mean, are we supposed now to, you know, manage our affairs with an eye to what anti-Semites might do? Are we supposed to put anti-Semites in control of Israel's foreign policy? That's not reasonable. But there is another claim, that if Israel does something like that, diaspora Jews, and in particular young Jews, will disconnect from Israel. They'll say, you know, if that's what Israel does, we don't want anything to do with Israel. Now, other people, myself included, I have to say, will say, well, this disconnect to a certain extent has begun to happen already, and not necessarily because of what Israel does, but as a result of assimilation. Not necessarily physical assimilation, but assimilation, ideological assimilation, I would call it. Assimilation of a certain ultra-universalistic ideology, which basically says, you know, being Jewish isn't that important, okay? And these youngsters are disconnecting not just from Israel. And this is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is they are disconnecting from Jewishness. And the disconnect from Israel is part of that, okay? And if you read the letter that some of them wrote to the Board of Deputies, you'll find things here. So basically they're saying, look, we're not rejecting Israel and Zionism, but we have broader beliefs, okay? And if it's a clash with our broader beliefs, then it's a no-brainer what we're going to choose, okay? And some people will say, myself included, what do you want? If you put political activists with a very partisan view of Israel, and you allow them to educate your youngsters in Jewish schools, not to mention non-Jewish schools, to educate your youngsters about the conflict, these partisan political activists, then what do you want? That's what happens. And I'm not the only one that says that. Jonathan Goldstein, who's the chair of the Jewish Leadership Council, he says, listen, it's our single largest issue. The disengagement of our youth from core Jewish values and from its association with Israel. It's not just association with Israel, it's disconnect from core Jewish values. And he said that nothing to do with annexation, okay? He said that in general, not in the context of annexation. And why does this happen? Well, we can learn straight from the horse's mouth. So Sarah Hirschhorn, she's, part of the hard left. She's very close to Yachad. They collaborated a lot in the past, but she's an academic. So she did a piece of research, and to her shock, I guess, she found that a lot of British teenagers are ashamed to be associated with Zionism. And why? Not because of what Israel does. And she says, and she's talking to liberal Zionists, to herself, to Yachad. She says, look, it's because of us. We are to blame. Ashamnu. We have failed an entire generation. Why? She says, because if we bombard these kids with all the things that, in our opinion, Israel does wrong, I'm sure Israel does a lot of things wrong, every country does, but Israel does a lot of good things as well. We can tell the kids also what should make them proud of Israel, but we don't. And if we don't do that, she says, then we have not only failed ourselves, but our future. Okay, but all that notwithstanding, let's take a deep breath and come back to the issue of practical objections. And I guess practical objections have to do with consequences. We're not saying this is wrong to do. We're saying if Israel does that, the consequences might be very bad, might be even catastrophic. So we're also saying, it depends how these consequences will be, catastrophic or just mildly unpleasant. And I guess this boils down to something else. We have to think, is the Israeli government even considering these possible consequences? Or are they going blind into something that they don't understand?
We believe it's possible to navigate these issues successfully, but I can assure you that in our decision-making process, these things are taken into account very, very seriously. It would be irresponsible of the government to do otherwise.
So this is the ambassador of Israel to the UK saying, look, folks, we are thinking about these things. No, we are thinking very, very seriously. We're not irresponsible. We just, after thinking about these things, we've decided that we can cope with this. It's not so bad, okay? Now, should we believe him or shouldn't we believe him? I don't know. You make your own minds about it. All I will say is I'm looking at, this new government that Israel has with all the criticism, and, this guy, and a lot of people really, really don't like this guy. But, he's been prime minister for 11 years now, and I wouldn't say there are a lot of catastrophes, but forget this guy. If I look at the other people that, are in this government, I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, first of all, these are not fanatics, okay? They're not Bible thumpers who will do things out of belief and, fanaticism. And they look to me like responsible people because, they've been, they discharged positions of great responsibility and discharged them relatively successfully. That doesn't mean that they're right. A lot of good people have made a lot of bad decisions. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying they don't look to me like people who will go into something, do or die without weighing the consequences.
You shouldn't get Islamists and the Arab Street confused. We poll in the Arab world. We do it, I can't tell you exactly how we do it, but we don't do it directly. We have to do it indirectly.
That's another thing. Yeah, did you know that Israel is conducting opinion polls in the Arab world, in Arab countries? I bet most of us didn't know that. It's not something that is being said publicly. It can't be said publicly. I'm very surprised Mark Regev said it. He probably was sorry that he said that, because some things are being done but are not being said. And what I mean by that, you know, we talk about these consequences and they are in the future. So we can only guess what they will be. And we're believing that quite naturally, we think that the government does the same, you know, they guess. And I suppose they do. But we forget that governments in general, and certainly the Israeli government, have access to information that we don't necessarily have access to. And they have tools to get information that we, as simple citizens, don't have. So just as an example, if Israel knows through certain sources from the, you know, inner sanctum of the European Union, that actually the European Union has decided, you know, we're going to talk a lot about it and talk very loudly, but we're not going to do anything about it, okay? Just as an example, is Israel going to say this publicly? They can't say it. Things might, you know, kind of leak, but they're not going to say this. They can't say it publicly. That, of course, doesn't mean that even with this information and these tools and so on, you know, they can't make mistakes. They can make mistakes. Maybe they miscalculate, maybe they misjudge things. It can happen. But I think it does show that, you know, this is not something that is being done blindly, without thinking, without considering the consequences, without assessing the consequences. And this brings me to another issue that I heard it said a lot, which is security experts oppose annexation. It's just the politicians want to do it, but the military people say it hurts Israel's security and are against it. And that's, I think, a dishonest statement, quite clearly. First of all, we're not talking security experts, because military commanders, generals in Israel can't make political statements. They're not allowed to. We're talking former officers, former generals, okay? And former is another way to say they're civilians now, okay? And like all other civilians, some of them support the annexation and others oppose the annexation. It's not one way. They are divided over the issue, like all Israeli citizens. And then, I guess, is this, you know, the way it's portrayed in the media sometimes, it's some kind of crazy right-wing idea that came to, you know, sprang to people's minds. But retention of the Jordan Valley has been Israeli policy for many, many years. Remember the Alon plan. If you look at the map of the Alon plan, you will see it's very, very similar to Trump's plan, actually. Yitzhak Rabin, in his last speech in the Knesset, said the following. He said, the state of Israel will include after the peace agreement, okay, that he wanted, will include most of the area of the former British mandate. There will be a Palestinian entity which will be less than a state, and we're not going back to 1967 lines. There will be, he said, a united Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty, and the security border of the state of Israel will be located in the Jordan Valley in the broadest meaning of that term, okay? That's not Netanyahu, that's Yitzhak Rabin. Yigal Allon, by the way, was also a member of the Labour Party, wasn't particularly right-wing. But, and the Israeli ambassador actually made this point several times recently. And it's interesting because the response from Yachad, for instance, has been, yeah, we know that Rabin said that, but Rabin wanted to do this in agreement with the Palestinians, while Netanyahu wants to do this unilaterally, and that's a problem. And the European Union says the same, you know, if you did it in agreement, it's fine. But many Israelis will say, well, we try to do it by agreement, you know, but there were so many proposals, but all these proposals were rejected. And in fact, even this latest plan, the Palestinian leadership has rejected it. You can see the date here before they even knew what's in it. So on the other hand, you're telling us all the time that the status quo is unsustainable. We've got to do something, and it's Israel's job to do something about it. You know, it's us that not the Palestinians. The Palestinians don't have to do anything. It's always the Israeli government that has to offer realistic strategies for ending the conflict, alternative solutions, and so on. So you ask us to do things, and then when we want to do something, you tell us, no, but that's the wrong thing to do. You never tell us what's the right thing to do. And when you tell us your thoughts, they're so unrealistic, it's like you're talking to us from Mars. And also Israelis will say, well, look, we looked at your behavior, Europeans, and you know, we find that you don't practice what you preach, you're very hypocritical, and you lost our respect, and we don't want to listen to you anymore. Now, you read, sorry, I'm going to mute somebody here. You read the bit about the security claim, you know, Jordan Valley as the security border of the State of Israel. Many Israelis do see Jordan Valley as necessary for security purposes, including, as we saw, Yitzhak Rabin, and that's as a bulwark against, or as a barrier, as a first line of defense against a future attack through Jordanian territory, not necessarily by Jordanians, but for instance by Iran or Iran-controlled forces. And if you're going to tell me that Iran is far away, no, it isn't. Iranian forces are very close today to Israeli borders. They're very close to the West Bank, actually. But it's not just a conventional attack, it's also terrorism, the infiltration of terrorism, smuggling of weaponry, such as rockets smuggled through tunnels. Remember the border between Egypt and Gaza and all the tunnels. There were hundreds of tunnels there, and rockets and terrorists and armament coming through those tunnels. And that was a very short border. This is 10 times longer, much more difficult to control. And it's interesting to see also the shape of the terrain there. So this here is the coastal plain of Israel, in which 70% of the Israeli population lives here, okay? And this is the Jordan Valley. So you can see any, this mountain area in the middle of the West Bank is full of caves, is full of valleys and so on. It's an ideal hiding place for terrorists, for weaponry, for rocket launchers and so on, if they manage to get there. And the only way to stop them from getting there is to control this strip of territory, so it can't be, you can't dig for so long under it. there's another argument, which is that in a counterintuitive way, this move, this incorporation, annexation move, may provide the Palestinian leadership with an incentive to start negotiating, to start making a deal. Because right now, according to what the European Union is telling them, they don't have much of an incentive to make what would be for them very hard decisions today. Because the European Union is telling them, you know, you've got your territory, your situation can only get better, not worse. And I don't know if this is the cause for this, but this is from yesterday, actually. It's really hot news that the Palestinian Authority has apparently submitted a counter-proposal to the US plan, a counter-proposal that calls for a demilitarized Palestinian state. If this is true, I don't know if it's true, okay? It's just an article in the newspaper. But if it's true, I think it's the first time that the Palestinian leadership submits a counter-proposal, let alone a counter-proposal that, you know, accepts the idea of a demilitarized state. So if it's true, this may be significant. This may be a sign that things are beginning to move somehow. Now, you know, the end chapter of all this, the one I'm sure you've all been waiting for, what should the Board of Deputies do when it's faced with this dilemma, okay? And it's no secret to you that the board has been under tremendous pressure from both sides of the argument, actually, to take a position. And big words have been bandied around, you know, duty, responsibility, violation of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. As for responsibility, I don't know, but I thought that diaspora Jewry, certainly British Jewry, is not responsible for the actions of the State of Israel. That's what we've always been saying. You know, we always said there's a document, that definition of anti-Semitism. We always said that it's anti-Semitic to hold British Jews responsible for the actions of Israel. But besides all that, let's say, for the purpose of the argument, for the sake of the argument, let's say that the board speaks against the annexation, as it's been required by certain people to do. What happens next time when Israel does something and the board doesn't say anything? It will be interpreted as agreement, support. You know, if you spoke against the annexation, you don't speak against this, then it's a sign you support it. That would imply a certain taking of responsibility already. Now, if the board is now under pressure to react to any action of the government of Israel, then what does that make of the board? What does it become? I didn't think this was its role. I thought, according to the Constitution, that the board's role was to represent the British Jewish community vis-a-vis the British government and its agencies. You know, preserve the interests of defend the interests, represent the interests of the British Jewish community. Nothing to do necessarily with Israel. Of course, the board's constitution also includes this kind of paragraph to advance Israel's security, welfare, and standing. That's all fine, but who decides what exactly advances Israel's security, welfare, and standing? Who decides that? The board? Of course, some things don't need a decision. You know, if there's an intention to impose sanctions on Israel, that then clearly doesn't advance Israel's security, welfare, and standing, and the board should, should oppose that. But other than that, who actually, who makes those decisions? What's good for Israel? And who makes the decisions actually what the British Jews think?
As you well know, because you've been the ambassador here for, for now 4 years, this community, the Jewish community in the UK, is a very pro-Israel community. It's by and large very supportive of Israel's right to exist and very defensive of Israel. And it's also a very pro-two-state community, very concerned about Israel's democratic character and the kind of consensus that exists in this community around the support for two states. There is also a similar consensus around, I guess, dislike of settlements or lack of support for the settlement projects in the West Bank.
Again, who purports to speak for the British Jewish community? The board, maybe. Yahad, I don't think so.
Now, I wouldn't, and I think after being here for 4 years, I've got a fair appreciation. I wouldn't classify the UK Jewish community in a specific political stripe vis-a-vis Israeli politics. I'd be very careful not to do that. I'm not sure that's true. Like you say to me, if you say to me, well, most UK Jews are against settlements. So from the perspective of the Palestinian Authority, neighborhoods of Jerusalem are also settlements. Are most British Jews against that? I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that's true at all. A lot of it is how you put the question and how you define the topic. But I mean, UK Jews don't get to vote in Israeli elections. If they make Aliyah, they can, of course. But as British people living in Britain, they vote in British elections, not in Israeli elections. But I do think that there is a respect for Israel's institutions and for the fact that we vote in Israel and we freely choose our leaders. And we vote more than most. As you know, in the last year, we voted 3 times. And I think there should be, and there is, a respect for the Israeli voters and their right to make their own decisions.
Is there a respect for the Israeli voters? I'm sure many of you have respect for what the Israeli voters think, but not everybody has this respect. Let me tell you something from my own experience, not Mark Regev's experience. I once participated in an event, and on the panel, there was a gentleman from a high-level official from New Israel Fund UK, and I asked a question. And the question was on similar lines. Why do you think you should make these decisions and not the Israeli voters? Why do you get involved? Why do you try to make decisions contrary to what the Israeli voters do? And the gentleman answered me like that. He said, I'll explain to you. If you see that your child is becoming a junkie, a drug addict, injects heroin, aren't you going to do something? Aren't you going to slam him in rehab? That's why we intervene, he said. And his answer shocked me a little bit. And I told him something like, look, there's a problem with your logic, We Israelis are not children. We're certainly not your children. Why do you put yourself above us? Why do you think you're the only adult in the room? And some Israelis may be junkies, but most Israelis are not junkies. So there's a problem there. So what can the board do? Okay, it can do one of 3 things. First of all, it can take the position of this gentleman and say, we know better than the Israelis what's good for Israelis, okay? There seems to me to be a lot of hubris in that. On the other hand, it can take the extreme opposite position and say, we support Israel, and because of that, every time the Israeli government makes a decision, we're going to support it. As an Israeli, I'm very grateful if you support us, But I think such a position would be unwise. It's true that in a democratic country like Israel, the government is the emanation of the people, but that doesn't mean that the people is behind every single decision of the government, and also the people can change their minds. So that would be unwise. In my opinion, you know, the board should say, we are supportive of Israel, we're proud of her achievements, you know, we would like to see her thrive, we will defend her if somebody wants to harm her, but as for the decisions of how to run the country, we have nothing to do with that. That's the prerogative of people who live there, who pay taxes there, who work there, and so on. And you know, that's more or less what the board said, actually. It pains me to admit, you know, I've been called things like controversial and argumentative. And so it really pains me to agree with the board, but I have to agree, you know, they seem to be right, to get that's right. Now, that's the board, okay? What about individual Jews? Well, individual Jews can do whatever they want. They can have any opinion and express it. What I don't understand sometimes is why do they have to express their opinion starting with, I'm speaking as a Jew? Why? Being a Jew, does it make you an expert in Middle Eastern politics? I don't think so. Does being a Jew mean is this two opinions? No, it's still one opinion. You know, a Jew still counts for one opinion, one vote, not two. I don't necessarily understand this. Now, what about prominent Jews, celebrities, or people who think they are celebrities? You know, again, they can do whatever they want. They're individuals. They can certainly write a letter to the Israeli ambassador. That's perfectly legitimate, the most legitimate thing in the world. What I don't understand is why write that letter in the first instance on the pages of a newspaper. You know, I wrote recently a letter of complaint to BT. I wrote the letter, I sent it to them, and I waited for their response. And once I get their response, I'll decide what I do next. Maybe I'll publish it in the newspaper, but you know, I have to hear first what they have to say. So in that letter, those prominent Jews say, and it sounds quite reasonable, we are not opposed to Israel taking unilateral steps to enhance Israel's security, advance peace, and protect Israel's existence, but annexation proposals meet none of those criteria. And I'm thinking, well, how do you know that? I mean, you are very smart individuals, very famous individuals, some of you, but you're none of you is a military experts, and military experts themselves are divided over this issue. So I'm thinking, wouldn't it have been more reasonable, rather than making this statement that I don't know what it's based on, wouldn't it have been more reasonable to ask the question, Mr. Mark Regev, Mr. Netanyahu, explain to us how this annexation enhances Israel's security? Tell us. And once we hear what you have to say, we'll make up our minds. Maybe it satisfies us, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't satisfy us, your explanation, you know, we'll see what we do with this. Maybe we'll publish it in the newspaper. Because if anything, if nothing else, I think academic rigor requires people to hear both sides of an argument before they make a determination. That's what I think. And then there's something else as well, okay? If somebody writes to the foreign minister, to the foreign secretary of the UK, okay, not of Israel, and says, Mr. Foreign Secretary, tell us, don't tell us words, okay? Tell us what action the UK government is going to take about this. Okay, this would be interpreted, and it will be interpreted, certainly by the UK government, as a call for sanctions against Israel. And it's very legitimate. I mean, these people are British citizens. It's completely legitimate for them to write to the UK government, to the UK Foreign Secretary, and express their opinion and their concerns. But what I don't understand is this is all legitimate, but once you've done this, can you still go to your supporters and your donors and say you're a pro-Israel organization? Is this what a pro-Israel organization does? I don't think so. Now, very quickly, some very, very brief conclusions. Whether the incorporation or annexation, however you want to call it, is a good idea or a bad idea, I don't know. It depends on the consequences, and we don't know the consequences. And my guess is as good as yours. But I'm going to say, should British Jews or Jews in general wring their hands in despair about this? You know, I don't think so. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what factors were brought into the equation. All we know, you know, when we don't know something, we judge it by the past. We judge it by track record. And I think Israel's track record is pretty good, actually. You know, it's not that the country didn't make mistakes, that governments didn't make mistakes, but they didn't make very big mistakes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. Now, I'm not asking anyone to take it on trust, to trust anyone blindly. Quite the opposite. Let's keep our eyes open. You know, I had a boss once who used to say, Noru, I trust you with my eyes closed. I only open my eyes from time to time to see that your eyes are open. Now, I always like to finish on a bit of a positive, optimistic note, okay? There might be some silver lining as well. You know, in Israel, we have a saying, Me'az yatsa matok. The only way I can translate it, it's not a good translation, but some blessings come in disguise. And there is also, you know, I'm a management consultant, and I don't deal in change management, but people who deal in change management will tell you that sometimes there's, it needs a crisis. If you don't have a crisis, people don't move, don't change. Even for a positive change, sometimes you need, first of all, a crisis. And maybe this is the crisis that will start moving things, okay? That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if there are questions, I'll try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Noru. There've been a lot of comments that won't surprise you, this being a mostly Jewish audience. And there are a few that are actual questions or that I have turned into questions. So I'm putting a few things together. A number of people have expressed concern about the International Criminal Court. Would you like to address their concerns?
That is definitely a concern. The only thing that I would say is that the you know, indictment is not the right word, because it's not an indictment. It's a decision to investigate. But that decision to investigate was taken before all this annexation talk was on the table. So that decision to investigate has nothing to do with the annexation. It has to do with what Israel did before the annexation, or is alleged to have done before the annexation. So in a way, in a strange, perhaps counterintuitive way, that actually serves Netanyahu, because it allows Netanyahu to say, listen, you know, these guys are persecuting us, are chasing us anyway. It doesn't matter if we do this or we do this, you know, they're going to come for us in any case. So it's like, it doesn't make any difference.
Thank you. So another question is, should Israel be concerned that the UK or other European governments could stop Israeli companies raising capital on their debt or equity markets? Do you think this is an issue of serious concern?
As far as I know, and I'm not a big expert on this, but I did deal a little bit in previous jobs with this, Israeli companies very rarely raise capital in Europe or in the UK. Israeli companies tend to raise capital either in Israel itself or very often in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Israeli companies, Israeli companies that are listed abroad, they tend to be listed in the United States on NASDAQ. You know, Israel is the second foreign country, obviously American companies are the second foreign country in terms of the number of companies listed on NASDAQ after China.
Yeah, fair enough. So I don't think it's quite a question, but a number of people are concerned that you've written off the anxiety from Israel as being unassimilated Jews. They're saying there are a lot of very unassimilated Jews who object to the policy of annexation. And do you think perhaps more note should be taken of that? And the fact that also Israelis are divided on the issue.
Okay, so first of all, you know, the difference between comments and questions. I differentiate between Jewish questions and Gentile questions. And the difference is Gentile questions usually finish with a question mark, and Jewish questions usually finish with an exclamation mark. But you know, it's not necessarily me who makes these arguments. I think a lot of Israelis make these arguments, and it's not necessarily about assimilated Jews, although, you know, we all, I think, recognize that assimilation is a problem throughout the diaspora, not necessarily in the UK only. But it's more a comment on, I would say, political assimilation rather than, you know, ethnic or national or religious assimilation. And by that, as I explained, I mean mostly the youngsters who go to school, go to universities in the UK and are taught, not taught is not the right word. They are indoctrinated rather than being educated. Okay, they are taught, if you wish, that there is only one correct way to think. And the correct way to think is what I called the ultra-universalist way, which you saw the words, okay, multiculturalism. I'm not against multiculturalism as such, but it depends how we define this. And often it is defined, or it is implied, that that's a kind of, you know, Jewishness doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or you're not Jewish, you know, you're just a good person and that's the only thing that matters. Now, I'm very aware that there are a lot of Jews who are, you know, dedicated Jews and, you know, not assimilated at all in any way, not politically and not in any other way, who are very, very worried about this. I don't dismiss this for a moment and I don't make light of it. Except I said at the end that in my opinion, I don't dismiss the concern, but I think some of the belief that it's a catastrophe, impending catastrophe, that some of that belief might be misplaced. Okay. Remember, just to remind you something that happened not so long ago, there was this nation law, okay? And there was a big thing in the media, and even the Board of Deputy spoke against it. And, there was a lot of things said. At the end of the day, practically speaking, what happened there? You know, a lot of Jews, a lot of very good Jews and very dedicated Jews and Jews who have a warm place in their hearts for Israel were very worried. But in practical terms, if we, you know, we're just, I don't know, a year or two after that, and we're looking back and we're thinking, were we right to be so concerned? What happened? Not much, I would think. And this may come as a bit of an anticlimax, but, you know, I don't think this is as big as it's being made to look. I don't think it's that big. I think if annexation does happen, we don't know that it will happen yet, but if it does happen, I think 3 or 6 months after the annexation, we will look back at it and we will think, nah, actually, what happened there? So, you know, Israel extended its law, applied its law over that territory. Okay, so what?
So this isn't a question, but quite a few people seem to think that you're mistaken in the idea that not a lot of Israeli companies raise money on the London Stock Exchange. I've had a quote here about billions from various different organizations, but moving on to actually a question.
I started by saying I'm not an expert on the issue. I don't know. It may happen, but I don't actually see a situation where the UK government will say, because you did this, Israel, we will not allow your companies to raise capital here. That, I think, is stretching belief.
Okay, so here is a question. Does Israel have any choice? If Israel decides not to annex, is that not accepting the view that it will not annex without their agreement? In other words, giving the EU a bit of a veto power.
Well, first of all, before we talk about the EU, Netanyahu will have to pass a much bigger hurdle, which is the agreement of the US. Without the agreement, without the green light and the support of the US administration, there is no way that the Israeli government will do this. And that's a much bigger issue than what the EU says, by the way. Okay, so I don't necessarily see it as a, you know, let me put it other ways. When it's convenient for Israel to take a certain line, then it takes a certain line, even if it would seem to hurt the national ego, okay? And the example I would give is the altercations with Hamas in Gaza. So we had rockets from Hamas, we bombed them back, and in the end, you know, we made a ceasefire agreement of sorts, okay? Because it was in Israel's interest. So I think with this as well, if the government was to decide that it's in Israel's interest not to annex, then issues of ego and what the Europeans would think would take second stage.
Okay. So, question: does the PA counter-proposal plan include Hamas? And if it doesn't, surely it's worthless.
I have no idea. As I said, nobody saw this counter-proposal. There was an article in the newspapers which came from, the article was written because of something that the Palestinian Prime Minister said, okay? So he said, we submitted a counter-proposal to the quartet, to the Middle East Quartet. And he said that counter-proposal includes a Palestinian, a demilitarized Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with some land swaps. That's what he said. And that's all that he said. So nobody knows. We don't even know if it's true. And it may be that what he calls a counter-proposal is just, you know, a letter with 2 lines sent to the European Union and to the other members of the quartet. It may not be, you know, a serious plan. So we don't know. Don't know. What we do know is that the Palestinian Authority likes to speak on behalf of the entire Palestinian people, even though we all know it doesn't control Gaza, but they like to speak for everybody.
Okay, so have you got any views on why Israeli citizenship is not being offered to the Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley?
Well, what I said is it will be offered to the Palestinians that will live not in the Jordan Valley in general, because, you know, but on the parts of the Jordan Valley that will be annexed by Israel. Those Palestinians who live on land that will be annexed by Israel, they will be offered Israeli citizenship. We're talking maybe about a couple of thousand Palestinians, or maybe 2,000-3,000 Palestinians at most. Okay, so not a huge number. I'm saying they will be offered Israeli citizenship. I'm sure they will be offered Israeli citizenship. I'm not saying for a moment that they will get Israeli citizenship, because as it happened in East Jerusalem, as it happened in the Golan, they will refuse it. They have no choice but to refuse it, because if they accept Israeli citizenship, they will be considered collaborators and, you know, and pursued. So, but they will be offered Israeli citizenship. They will have that option.
Okay, I think that's covering a lot of the questions, although there's been quite a bit of discussion on the group chat. Danielle Sureya asks, could we get the slide pack as some very interesting charts? Can I just say to everybody that as we did last time, we're recording this webinar. We will make the video available, but if people want specifically the slide packs, then that can probably be arranged if people email me. But just to say, they are rather large in my experience in terms of megabytes. There's also been an awful lot of people saying nice things about this evening. And I'm just looking at the latest comments. Mark Regev in the Yahed interview seemed to agree that the numbers in the Jordan Valley is about 60,000 Arabs. And otherwise it's thank yous. So unless there's any burning new question, it may be that we're getting to the point of saying thank you very much.
So just to say something about the 60,000, if we count the entire Jordan Valley, there are probably 65,000 Arabs. Most of them, by the way, in and around Jericho. Jericho is a city of some 25,000, and if I take the hinterland around it, there are more than 40,000 just there. But Jericho is Area A. Jericho will not be annexed. It cannot be annexed because it's Area A. It's under. And by the way, before you finish, Judy, I just wanted to show this thing. Maybe you make a comment about this. So.
Absolutely. Well, I want to say there have been a lot of very, very positive comments about last seminar and about this seminar already. And so we've been encouraging Noru to think about carrying on. And here's the next seminar, which I think everybody will find fascinating, on the 30th of June. So you've got a little breather before then. The hard left's problem with Jews and Israel. Will Starmer stamp it out? So I think that could be very interesting. Do you want to say anything more about that, Noru?
Only for those of you who are not British and not so knowledgeable about British politics. So, but I'm sure you all know that the Labour Party in the UK slipped very much towards the hard left with the previous leader, with Jeremy Corbyn and his people, and now they have, obviously they suffered a very painful defeat in elections, and they dumped Corbyn. He resigned, let me say, and they have a new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer is more to the center, certainly compared with Corbyn. And the question is, we all know, well, I'm saying we all know, but that will be part of the analysis, the problem that the hard left has with Jews and with Israel, with the Jewish state, and whether the new leader, or in other words, whether the Labour Party under the new leader will change that position, and to what extent, if at all, to what extent they will change that position. Just to make one last comment here, you see this picture here, the background. This is a picture from the Labour Party conference under Corbyn, when the entire huge hall was full of Palestinian flags. It was the only flag that was waved at that conference. The British flag was not waved. Only the Palestinian flag was waved, and the whole hall was full of Palestinian flags.
Well, clearly you like controversial subjects, so a really controversial subject is suggested for the fourth talk, which is, what are the chances of Spurs getting into the Premier League? Anyway,
I am controversial, but that's a topic I won't risk approaching.
Okay. Well, there've been a lot of thank yous. Comment here about that the flag was handed out to the audience as they went in, and the next one that they think here will ban the Palestinian flag. But anyway, I want to say thank you once again, Noru. You have made a really complex subject matter into something that's comprehensible and given us a very balanced and interesting approach to all of that. So thank you very much. And I say to everyone else, looking forward to seeing you next time.